After I graduated from college, my first job was as a special investigator with the New York Capitol Defender's Office, which is the public defender's office that works on death penalty cases in New York City. And it was my job to put together what we called biopsychosocial developmental life histories of people that were facing the death penalty because they had committed a heinous murder. And my very first client, my first day, Jason, had kidnapped, tortured, and murdered a young woman who was exactly my age. After days of going through case files and looking at crime scene photos, I went to Rikers Island for the first time, fully intending on meeting someone like Hannibal Lecter. But when I got there, I met a very young, broken, mentally ill man who had lived the saddest life I'd ever heard. And we developed a saying in that office, which was, the worse the crime, the worse the story. And it was always true. It never excused the crime, but you could see the pathway that gets someone to the point of murder. And it's understanding that pathway that lets us prevent future violence. When it comes to mass shootings, we do not understand that pathway. And because we don't understand it, we can't prevent. All we do is react. I'm a college professor, so I have to include theory. And so far, we've been using routine activity theory to talk and think about mass shootings. Routine activities theory is simple. It states that crime and violence happens when three things come together. You have a motivated offender, a suitable target, and a lack of capable guardians. So when it comes to mass shootings, we're assuming that the motivated offender just exists. So the best that we can do is harden targets through security or increase our guardianship. So that means in schools, we're running our kids through lockdown drills, we're spending billions of dollars on homeroom security, we're putting police officers in the corridors, and we're even arming our teachers. And it's safe to say it's not working, because you can't get to true prevention until you understand who those motivated offenders are and why they're motivated. So this is why myself, my research partner, James Densley, and a group of Hamline undergraduate students started building a database 2 years ago of every mass shooting that's occurred since 1966. So each 160 mass shooters is coded on over 50 pieces of life history information. And this is a project that was recently given a large grant by the National Institute of Justice. So each shooter is coded on things like early childhood trauma, peers, school, social media use, interest in past violence or past shootings, mental health problems, suicidality, all using publicly available records. As part of this research, we're also researching the communities where mass shootings occur and creating a separate community database, and we're actually conducting interviews with living incarcerated mass shooters and people who knew them. The goal of this entire project is to understand the pathway that gets someone to the point of committing a mass shooting so we can prevent other people from ever getting to that point. Now today, I'm talking about school mass shootings specifically, because this month marks the 20-year anniversary of the Columbine High School shooting, where 12 students and one teacher lost their lives in what was at the time the worst massacre at a high school in US history. So we've had 20 years now to grieve, to learn, to act, and to prevent. And yet schools today are no safer than they were 20 years ago. And in fact, last year, 2018, was the worst year on record for the number of students who died in shootings at their schools. Last Valentine's Day, the shooting in Parkland, Florida, where 17 people lost their lives, students and staff, it surpassed Columbine as the worst shooting at a high school in US history. Now, when you talk about mass shootings and mass school shootings, the first problem is defining what you're talking about, and no one can really agree on a definition. So the Washington Post recently put together a database of every time a gun was fired in an elementary, middle, or high school since Columbine. They identified 220 incidents of gunfire over those 19 years. But the number of those that meet the criteria, The FBI definition of a mass shooting, which is 4 or more people who died in a single incident, it's only 6. So we went through and we reanalyzed those 220 cases to figure out how many of those were intended to be mass shootings. So in how many of those cases did the perpetrator come in heavily armed with the goal of firing indiscriminately at numerous people? Our number was 45. That's an average of 2.4 a year, and that number has been consistent over time. There was no profile of a mass shooter, right? No exact sort of check boxes you could mark off. Each perpetrator had a really different and complex pathway towards violence. However, there were some patterns. All of the mass shooters and attempted mass shooters were male, and the majority were white. Over 90% were current or former students of that school. 87% were in a crisis prior to the shooting, and 80% were suicidal prior to the shooting. 78% of them specifically leaked their plans ahead of time, usually on social media. Now, because of their age, school shooters typically can't purchase guns, so they end up stealing them from people they know, most often their family members. School shooters use more guns than other forms of mass shooters, and the schools where mass shootings occur are whiter and wealthier than the schools where other forms of gun violence occur. So if you take just these facts, you can make some sense of why our current strategies are not working. If over 90% of perpetrators of mass shootings are current or former students of the school, then running students through lockdown drills doesn't make sense even from a security standpoint. You're training potential perpetrators in the exact response a school has. Kids today are running through 5 and as many as 10 lockdown drills a year, starting in preschool through 12th grade. As a psychologist who studies violence, I'm concerned that we are literally handing students a blueprint for this form of violence, and then we're asking them to rehearse it over and over and over and over again, which can trigger a fascination in vulnerable students. And as a parent of 3 kids, I'm concerned with research showing that these drills are traumatic, and my own research showing that they increase anxiety. This generation is known as the school shooting generation, and they have more mental health problems than generations before them. Our research shows that a school shooting is really a murder-suicide. In every one of these cases, the student intended to die in the act. And in focusing on that suicidality component, it might give us new pathways to prevention. And our research is showing that the key point at intervention is the threat of violence, because the vast majority threaten. Right now in schools, when someone threatens violence, they get punished. We suspend, we expel. The FBI is actually pushing for criminal charges for threats of violence. That's adding fuel to a fire, and it actually increases the risk that violence will occur. Instead, we have to think about threats of violence as a cry for help and possibly the sign of a suicidal crisis. It's our moment to connect, and intervention should be holistic. Not criminal charges or punishment, but mental health care, substance abuse, social services, family involvement, peer support. It should be long-term, it should be ongoing, and there should be consistent follow-up. And in order for that to happen, the schools have to be resourced to do it, and the resources have to be available and accessible in the community. As part of this research, I interviewed a woman who was a school teacher, and a school shooting actually occurred in her classroom. And during this interview, she talked about the horror of having her young students get lined up against the back wall and get executed one by one in front of her. In that same interview, she talked about a time 2 years prior where that student who would become the school shooter was a student in her English class. And one day he approached her and slowly rolled up his sleeves and showed her cut marks that he had down his arms. She was a brand new teacher with no training in what to do or say in this situation. She describes panicking. She thinks she brought in another teacher, that a form was filed with the office, but she's pretty sure nothing came of it and nothing happened. Our research is showing that we need to train all adults in schools, teachers, administrators, and staff, in suicide prevention, crisis intervention, and de-escalation. Because you don't know who a student in crisis is going to reach out to. It might be the counseling office, or it might be the shop teacher, or it might be the receptionist. And in one averted school shooting that we studied, it was the janitor that intervened and talked the student down. I've been in the community training people in these skills, how to de-escalate a crisis using verbal and nonverbal skills, and these skills are really teachable, they're easily mastered, and they can save lives. As part of this research, I also interviewed a principal who stood in a bathroom doorway and single-handedly talked down a student inside who was dressed in black, holding 2 shotguns, ready to shoot the cafeteria. He managed to talk him down and disarm him with no help, and the gun didn't go off. So I asked him what we need to do to prevent mass shootings in schools. And he said his answer was one word: relationships. He said it's strong, healthy relationships between students and adults in the building. That way students have someone to reach out to when they're in crisis, adults notice when a student's in crisis, and students feel comfortable reaching out when they're concerned about their classmates and their peers. I am a firm believer that research and data can move us forward. It helps us assess what we've been doing and figuring out if it's been working, and it helps ground our policy conversations in numbers and data and evidence. And in this case, it can take us from reacting to school shootings and rehearsing for them to actually preventing them from occurring. Thank you.